The movie opens with a middle-aged woman named Maggie waking up in a sparsely furnished house. Immediately after getting up, she makes herself a cup of coffee. She then freshens up quickly and proceeds to get ready for work. Being a frozen food executive, Maggie grabs a couple of boxes of food samples and walks out of her house. On the other hand, Hank Daniels, a chef, makes a freshly baked pie for his daughter's breakfast. He excitedly asks her to try it, but she ignores him completely. It turns out that someone had hacked her school's website and changed everyone's grade. Because of this, she groans in frustration and tries to walk away. However, Hank stops her and asks her to try his dish. Sadly, his daughter Hannah refuses to do so, insisting that she's completely vegan. Moments later, Hannah leaves for school, leaving Hank and his pie all alone. With no one else to eat it, Hank eats all the food himself and nods in satisfaction. The scene now shifts to Maggie, who rushes into her boss's office and declares that she has new product ideas. With an enthusiastic smile, she explains that she wants to create a line of gourmet frozen food that will satisfy their customers' taste buds. Maggie's boss, Andrea, is quite impressed by the idea and asks her to go ahead. That's when Maggie reveals that she has already thought of several food options for the line. Furthermore, she tells Andrea that she wants to hire Hank as the main chef for their food. She then goes on to add that Hank has a one-star Italian restaurant called Osteria, with delicious food. Upon hearing all this, Andrea asks Maggie to go back to the restaurant, try a couple more dishes, and then talk to Hank regarding their partnership. In the meantime, Hank opens up his restaurant for the day and starts prepping for when the customers arrive. Just then, Bernie, the restaurant's manager who's also his brother-in-law, shows up and asks him if he has planned on launching any new dish in the restaurant. In response, Hank exclaims that he will always stick to the classic Italian cuisine. Soon after, customers begin flooding in, so Hank and his team start creating all sorts of delicious meals. Just then, Maggie arrives at the restaurant as well. On the other hand, a very stressed Bernie takes up several calls since he's behind on almost all of the restaurant's bills. Despite this, he requests his clients to deliver the ingredients required in the restaurant. The scene now cuts back to Maggie, who orders 7 different dishes to try. The waitress asks her if someone will be joining her soon. Maggie replies that she's dining alone, which causes everyone at the restaurant to think that she's a gourmet food critic. However, it turns out that the guy sitting behind her is the actual food critic. Hank, along with all the other chefs and even servers, tends to Maggie with the utmost respect. They bring her food out almost instantly, which really angers the actual food critic since no one had even taken his order. Moments later, Hank himself walks out and greets Maggie cordially. He even gives her a free glass of Prosecco. He then tries to strike up a conversation but is suddenly bombarded by a series of complaints. Maggie, who has been following his cookbook for quite a while now, asserts that his recipes are too time-consuming. Furthermore, she complains that the measurements are not precise, which can sometimes be very confusing. In response, Hank simply smiles and exclaims that his book isn't for someone who wants to cook precisely, but for someone who wants to cook with their heart. Maggie nods at that, and then asks him the million-dollar question. With an excited smile, she asks him if he would like to partner up for a line of gourmet frozen food. Hank immediately refuses, saying he doesn't believe in food that isn't fresh. Meanwhile, the food critic behind Maggie starts to get more agitated by the second. He dislikes the service there as well as the blatant ignorance. Now enraged, he beckons Hank over and exclaims that he has received the wrong order. Hank tries to de-escalate the situation but ends up worsening it instead. As a result, the food critic ends up storming out of the place. When Hank tries to go back to Maggie, Bernie approaches him and informs him that Hannah has actually been suspended. It turns out that she had also hacked into the school system to try and change everyone's grades back to what it originally was. Sadly, she got caught and as a result, was suspended with a warning regarding expulsion. Hank immediately picks her up from school and drops her home. He then returns back to the restaurant only to find out that they have received a very bad review from the critic. So, instead of receiving a 2nd star, they ended up losing the 1-star title as well. According to the critic, the service at the restaurant was very slow, and the ambiance as well as the menu was very boring and stale. Hank is shocked to hear this and cannot comprehend why something like this would happen. But despite the awful news, he continues to work and serve everyone else at his establishment. Hours later, he returns back home, checks on Hannah, and then goes to sleep. After reviewing all of Hank's dishes, Maggie decides to go ahead with her plan. She sets up a meeting with all the board members of the company and tells them that Hank's dishes would go perfectly with their flash freezing process. She then adds that over the past couple of years, Osteria had collected a lot of debt. Considering this in mind, she and Andrea decide to make an offer that Hank would never decline. Back at Osteria, Hank brings Hannah along with him since she has nothing better to do. He asks her to complete all her assignments in his office, whilst he works in the kitchen. After Hannah leaves, he proceeds to go back to work, but that's when Maggie and Andrea arrive at the restaurant to talk about their offer. When Hank sees Maggie, he instantly loses his temper and accuses her of calling his menu stale. Confused, Maggie instantly denies the allegations and also clarifies that she's no food critic. She and Andrea then officially introduce themselves. After the initial awkward introduction, Maggie tells Hank that she wants to help him and then offers him a partnership for the Gourmet frozen food line. Hank is initially confused by the proposal, so Andrea clarifies by saying that her company will help him pay off all his bank loans. It turns out that about 10 years ago, Hank's now deceased wife, Karen, took out a huge loan from a bank under Osteria's name to get it up and running. But sadly, after she passed, Bernie couldn't handle all the payments, causing multiple bills and loans to stack up. So, in order to resolve this problem, Maggie asks Hank to help them prepare various gourmet frozen meals that would be transported all over the country. As expected, Hank straight up refuses the offer. However, Maggie doesn't give up. Instead, she offers to work as a consultant for the restaurant to revamp some of his old recipes. That way, they could reach a new client base and could also create a line of delicious frozen meals. Hank contemplates the offer for quite a while, and then asks them about the payment that he'd receive in the end. Andrea tells him that they'll pay him handsomely for every new recipe he creates. Finally, after a whole lot of thinking, Hank agrees to the offer. The very next day, Maggie comes back to the restaurant with a contract for their partnership. She quickly sets up her laptop and starts working right away. Hank quietly observes it all and sighs at her bossy attitude. Meanwhile, Maggie makes herself quite comfortable in Hank's office. She observes the place for quite some time. Whilst doing so, she notices a big pile of past due bills that Bernie hadn't yet paid. It's evident that Osteria had been suffering very badly. Confused by all the bills, Maggie asks Bernie as to why he hadn't paid them. In response, Bernie tells her that managing the entire place wasn't really his forte. It turns out that when Karen was alive, she used to manage the entire place. But after she passed, Hank fell apart, and Bernie had to take up the role of manager. Because of all this, the restaurant couldn't do so well financially. Upon learning all this, Maggie sympathizes with Bernie and tries to help him take care of the finances. After a while of working, Maggie enters the kitchen and introduces herself to all the chefs and servers there. The atmosphere gets quite awkward, as no one replies back to her, so she just quietly walks away. As soon as she leaves, Hank rolls his eyes and complains about Maggie having an attitude. He asserts that if it wasn't for the money, he wouldn't tolerate her at all. The other chefs readily agree with him and scoff at the fact that they now have to make frozen Italian meals. Shortly after, Hank approaches Maggie and tells her that the whole introducing yourself to the entire team part was just unnecessary. With a deep sigh, he asks her to talk to him and suggest any ideas that she has in the office only. Maggie is incredibly offended by this and doesn't accept his dictate at all. Instead, she says that she has ideas worth sharing. In response, Hank tells her that his restaurant is not a think tank, so he doesn't want any opinions from her. Maggie is enraged upon hearing this, so she storms out of the office after giving him an earful. Hank, on the other hand, follows Maggie and accuses her of trying to steal his restaurant. Hank laughs at the allegation and states that she just wants to get Osteria back on track so that he can focus on making the best frozen meals ever known. Maggie then tells Hank that if he comes up with incredible frozen food recipes, she will get his restaurant's star back. Hank readily agrees to the offer and even tries to show Maggie the entire working process of Osteria. He tells her all about sourcing good ingredients and cooking food with love. After an entire lesson on running a successful restaurant, Hank gives Maggie some cooking lessons. He teaches her how to peel potatoes and tries to help her learn the value of patience. However, Maggie gets incredibly bored by this, so she runs away from the kitchen. A couple hours pass by and Hank continues making different dishes for the customers. He focuses entirely on the food being made and even gives a couple of helpful suggestions to the other chefs in the kitchen. Meanwhile, at Hannah's school, the bus breaks down, so all the children start notifying their parents about the situation. Hannah tries to do the same, but unfortunately, Hank doesn't pick up. With no other way out, she calls the restaurant, and thankfully, Maggie picks up. She talks about her dilemma and complains that Hank won't receive any of her calls. Upon learning this, Maggie immediately tells Hank about Hannah's predicament. Seeing as Hank is way too busy, she offers to pick Hannah up from school. Hank readily agrees and thanks her for all the help. Soon after, Maggie and Hannah drive back home. The two bond really nicely on their way, so they decide to spend some more time together. Maggie orders pizza and even braids Hannah's hair. As a result, the two get really close to one another. A while later, Hank finally shows up at the house and is shocked to see Maggie still taking care of Hannah. He profusely thanks her for the help and even offers her a glass of wine. Maggie takes him up on the offer, and so, the two start drinking and chatting together. Hank tells Maggie all about his love for cooking. He then tells her about his life with Hannah. After a while of talking about himself, Hank asks Maggie about herself. In response, she simply smiles and exclaims that she actually got married right after college. However, her husband moved out of state, started an affair with his assistant, and so, the two ended up divorcing. Because of this very reason, she had given up on love and hadn't been in a relationship ever since. Hank understands her situation and then tries to change the topic. However, that's when Maggie gets a call from Andrea, asking for a progress report. Now in a hurry, she quickly bids him goodbye and walks away. The very next morning, Andrea starts pressuring Maggie into starting the production for the Gourmet frozen food line ASAP. Maggie tries to ask for some more time, just to get Osteria back on track. However, Andrea ignores her and asks her to focus on their company more than some average Italian restaurant. Not wanting to argue any further, Maggie agrees with her and promises to start the production soon. The scene now cuts back to Hank, who hurriedly prepares a series of breakfasts for Hannah. With a warm smile, he urges her to stop being picky and eat up. Hannah smiles at that, and then, out of the blue, asks him what he thinks of Maggie. Hank is confused by the question and inquires as to why he's being bombarded with questions about his consultant. In response, Hannah informs him that Maggie is a very beautiful, kind, and accomplished lady who could really help them. Hank blushes at that and just nods at her. Shortly after, Hank goes back to the restaurant and compliments Maggie on her shoes. Maggie thanks him and tries to reciprocate. As a result, the two end up flirting very awkwardly, so they just go back to what they were originally doing. Moments later, the restaurant's bartender storms into the kitchen, grabs his stuff, and proceeds to walk out. Now concerned, Hank asks him what he's doing. In response, the bartender tells him that Maggie actually fired him. After insulting her for a good few seconds, he walks out of the restaurant. Confused by this sudden change, Hank approaches Maggie and asks her the reason for firing their bartender. That's when Maggie informs him that the bartender was actually stealing bottles of wine from the restaurant every single night. Because of this, the wine inventory was always empty. Hank is shocked by this and instantly calms down. He then asks what they would do without a bartender. Thankfully, Bernie chimes in just then and says that he will be handling the bar from now on. In the meantime, Maggie would manage Osteria until they find someone new. After sorting everything out, Maggie asks Hank to join her in the food lab so that they can start with the production. She explains that Andrea is getting more impatient by the second and wants to release the new line as soon as possible. Hank understands the situation, thus agreeing to go to the frozen food lab. Shortly after, Maggie and Hank reach the frozen food lab where the scientist there explains the entire process of creating delicious frozen meals. He then asks Hank to try their new product, frozen paella. Now excited, Hank immediately takes a bite, but ends up hating it. He asserts that there's definitely room for improvement. In turn, Maggie tells him that's exactly why they need his help. Sometime later, the two return back to the restaurant, only to find out that they're completely out of pasta. Thankfully, Hank doesn't stress and decides to make it from scratch instead. He also takes this opportunity to teach Maggie how to make authentic pasta. Soon, both he and Maggie start kneading. Hank instructs her on every single step. Eventually, the two get really close and even joke around every once in a while. Later that night, the entire staff walks out for the day, but Maggie and Hank continue working. They clean the entire restaurant together, and after a while, decide to relax with a drink. Hank tries to initiate a conversation, but Maggie interrupts him by saying that she's thought of some changes to bring to the restaurant. She suggests they renovate Osteria and also reintroduce the menu with new food items, removing the ones that aren't popular. Hank contemplates for a while, and then asks Maggie what kind of dishes she wants. Having done her research, Maggie talks to him about different dishes that are not only popular, but also a lot cheaper to make. Now impressed, Hank readily agrees to the idea. The next day, Hannah surprises Hank at the restaurant and tells him that she's going to finish her assignments in his office. She quickly heads over to the office and sees Maggie's coat on the chair. Hannah really likes the coat, so she excitedly tries it on. Maggie walks in just then and happily tells Hannah that the coat really suits her. She then asks Hannah to redesign the restaurant's website since they're making changes to the entire place. In return, Maggie offers to take Hannah shopping. Hannah immediately agrees and starts working on the website right away. A couple of days later, Hannah completes the website's makeover, so Maggie takes her to a nearby shopping mall. There, The two try on a series of fun outfits that match their style. Eventually, Maggie and Hannah both buy a ton of clothes and makeup. Later that evening, the two return home and show Hank their shopping bags excitedly. Hannah runs into her room to try her clothes again. Meanwhile, Maggie stays back with Hank and discusses a few other things about the restaurant's renovation. Hank then asks Maggie to come with him to the Monday night mashup, where they can try different dishes for the frozen food line. Maggie readily agrees to the idea, and so, the two of them along with Hannah go to a night market where they try all sorts of foods. Maggie loves the dishes there and happily praises Hank's food choices. As time passes by, Hank comes up with new frozen food ideas. He partners up with several food scientists to come up with gourmet frozen food that is actually delicious. In the meantime, Maggie works on redecorating and changing the entire ambiance of the place, which racks in more customers. Not just that, she also continues promoting Osteria, which really impresses Hank. As a result, the two get really close and even start developing feelings for each other. They spend a lot of time together and enjoy each other's company. One day, Hank buys a couple of short ribs for a new recipe and invites Maggie to dinner. Maggie readily agrees, and so the two head back to his place. There, Hank cooks the short ribs for Maggie and even tells her that she's been a good influence on her. Maggie simply laughs at that and praises him for his compliance. Moments later, Hank asks her to try the dish. Maggie enthusiastically does so and is surprised at how good it tastes. Now beaming, she tells Hank that the short ribs are the best thing she has ever tasted in her life. Hank is overjoyed to hear this. He thanks her and then slowly leans over her. He then kisses her passionately, and Maggie reciprocates right back. Sadly, they are interrupted by Hannah running into the living room. Now wanting the situation to get awkward, Maggie bids Hank goodbye and happily walks out of the place. The following day, Maggie takes Hank to the restaurant and excitedly shows him the newly renovated place. Hank is awestruck by the beauty of his restaurant and thanks Maggie for her hard work and dedication. Not just that, she even gets new uniforms for the entire staff that Hank happily approves of. Now that the restaurant is fully renovated, Hank feels as though a huge burden has been lifted off his shoulders. Because of this, he fully focuses on creating the best frozen meals for Maggie's company. After a whole lot of production and preparation, Andrea comes into the lab and tastes some of the dishes. As expected, she is surprised at how good the food tastes. Now thoroughly impressed, she asks the scientists to go into full production. A while later, Andrea calls Maggie into her office and commends her for her incredible job. She then asks Maggie to focus on a new line of Spanish gourmet food. Andrea clarifies that she doesn't care about any restaurant. All she cares about is her company. Maggie is shocked to hear this and asks Andrea what she plans on doing with Hank. To her surprise, Andrea tells her that they don't need Hank anymore because they already have all his recipes. Upon hearing all this, Maggie retorts by saying that this isn't fair at all. She asserts that they need to help him pay off his loans. Andrea, however, simply laughs at that and states that they won't be paying him anymore. When Maggie tries to fight back, Andrea threatens to fire her. As a result, Maggie agrees to what she says and walks out of the office. Hours later, Maggie goes to Osteria in hopes of telling Hank the truth about Andrea's plan. She asks to speak to him privately and then quietly walks into his office. Hank joins her soon after and asks her what the matter is. Initially, he thinks that she's going to confess her feelings, but his face instantly drops when Maggie tells him that she now has to go to another chef. Maggie tries to explain the entire situation. Unfortunately, Hank refuses to listen to her and accuses her of playing with his and Hannah's feelings. He thinks that her trying to help him get his restaurant star back was nothing more than a scam. Maggie is incredibly hurt by Hank's words, so she instantly walks away. Back in the kitchen, Hank calls an emergency meeting and informs all his staff that Maggie will be leaving them. He further adds that they'll need to find an investor soon, or else the bank will shut them down. Hannah is shocked to hear all this and asks her father where Maggie is. That's when Hank explains the entire situation to his staff, and even tells them that he was the one who made her leave. Bernie is incredibly annoyed upon hearing this. Enraged, he tells Hank that it was Maggie who helped them and also fought for them. Hannah, along with all the others, agrees with Bernie and tells Hank that he made a really big mistake. As a result, Hank immediately realizes that he messed up really badly and desperately tries to make things right. On the other hand, Maggie, very upset, reminisces about her moments at Osteria and looks at the restaurant's website mindlessly. Just then, Hank shows up at her door. Surprised, Maggie lets him in and asks if he's all right. Hank replies that he is, and then proceeds to apologize to her for his harsh words. He thanks her for all that she's done and begs her to forgive him. In the end, Hank confesses to Maggie that he doesn't want to lose her. Maggie carefully listens to all that he has to say, and after a while of thinking, she accepts his apology. And being the genius that she is, Maggie comes up with a plan to save Osteria. The very next day, Andrea shows up at the restaurant upon Maggie's request. With a nasty scoff, she asks why she was called there. In response, Maggie confidently tells Andrea that Hank has already found an investor for the restaurant. Andrea, however, doesn't believe her and inquires who the investor is. That's when Maggie reveals that it's none other than herself. She explains that she has a little money saved up, so she's going to bring Osteria back to its glory. Andrea is enraged by this news, so she immediately fires Maggie. She insults the two of them profusely before storming out of the place. After she leaves, Hank announces to his crew that not only did Maggie save them, she also re-invited the gourmet food critic to try their new and improved menu. Thankfully, the critic agreed to come back. Upon hearing this, Bernie along with all the servers and chefs immediately get to work. Whilst the chefs prepare the food carefully, Hank reviews everything and ensures that nothing goes wrong. That very night, the gourmet food critic arrives at the restaurant and is shocked to see the new interior. Not expecting much, he sits down at a table and orders a series of dishes, including Hank's special short ribs. So Hank, along with all the other chefs, starts working really hard and cooking everything to perfection. They then bring out all the dishes almost instantaneously, which impresses the food critic. After serving all the dishes, Hank and Maggie wait anxiously for the critic to say something. However, when Maggie looks at the food critic, she sees him smiling like he's eaten the best thing he's ever had in his life. Hank is elated to hear that. The two of them then excitedly celebrate their success. Moving forward, Hank thanks Maggie for redefining his restaurant and asks her to work as a permanent manager for Osteria. Maggie readily agrees to the idea and kisses him passionately. The movie finally ends with Hank and Maggie kissing and starting a new chapter of their lives together.